Thanks, Marjorie. I always love the way you read. So I was trudging up the hill behind where I live, getting my early morning exercise, and talking to Pastor Uriel on the phone, because after all, multitasking is a good, virtuous thing, right? And he, being the gracious, other-centered guy that he is, Pastor Uriel began the conversation on the phone by saying, "And Beth, how are you?" Which was such a lovely thing. And I decided, well, I shouldn't be some superficial, perfect-seeming person. Let me disclose some realities to him. So I told him how I was just going through this time where I was feeling like I wasn't getting very much accomplished. Sure, I was doing a lot for my kids and my family, and I could list things I did, but I just didn't feel like, especially in the professional realm, that I was getting very much accomplished. And I was feeling kind of frustrated about that. I wasn't being productive enough. Well, his response was actually sympathetic. He said he could really relate. And I assume that maybe some of you also can relate to this. I wonder if you have found yourself saying things like, "I have nothing to show for the day," or "It's been another interesting day, but with little accomplished," as my 91-year-old mother does. Well, perhaps underneath these statements that me and my mom make are some hidden ways of thinking. We need to be productive in a visible way, making an obvious difference for others, or maybe even just for ourselves. Whatever we do needs to have purpose and efficacy and impact. It's got to cause a difference for others or in the world. It's a purpose-driven life, after all, right? When we die, we have to leave a visible mark, an outstanding legacy, right? And then I was thinking about this a little more, even just the last day or so, and I was like, is this something that's really about my need to compete with others and be better than them? Are we thinking that what we do is needing to be acceptable? Is it maybe really about wondering if we're worthwhile? Are we important, valuable, respected, or the perennial thing I'm trying to achieve, adoration? Are we really seeking to be deeply loved, beloved? Or perhaps this is just a reflection of what Max Weber wrote about way back in the previous century in his famous book called The Protestant Work Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism. He argued that Protestant theology led to the thinking that we must work hard to follow a vocational calling, and in doing so, we show obedience to God, and so earn our salvation. Is that what this is really about? Maybe this sort of thinking that I need to be productive is really about trying to get a ticket into heaven, to be accepted by God. Is it about obeying our parents and teachers who taught us that we need to work hard and earn whatever rewards that we deserve? We have to be productive to have food to eat and a bed to sleep on. It is this Protestant work ethic that many would argue is what has made the USA the economic giant that it's been. But what if the inner tension that I have is not doing more, but being productive enough? Now, some of you may not relate to this problem. Thank God for you. I may be preaching a sermon to myself. So I just invite you to listen in and pray that there might still be some nugget that is Spirit-given here for you as well as for me. I'm not going to promise you a perfect answer to this problem of am I perfect or am I productive enough? But I'm going to share some disparate pieces that for me begin to provide meaning to the question. Perhaps by revisiting this question of purpose, we can live into the answer. So I want to share with you basically two stories that I think are helpful for me as I ask the question. So a good place to start, we're in a Christian church, right? So let's start with the story of Jesus. There are some texts that make me wonder if Jesus actually struggled with feeling not productive enough, not efficacious. That what his whole mission was about was not going to be impactful enough, that not enough lives would be changed, that the course of human history would not notice his short-lived ministry. After all, he didn't heal everyone. His ministry only lasted a very few years. He didn't seem to change the ruling empire or even the local leaders. Given this, it's not surprising that he sometimes showed exasperation. Yes, he did, right? Let me share with you some illustrations. Okay, in Matthew 8, the story where they're out on the Sea of Galilee and the storm comes up and his disciples in the boat are fearful for their lives and he's sound asleep. And what does he say first to them? He addresses them by saying, "You of little faith." You would think that these disciples, these guys that hung with him every day for a while, would have been full of faith, right? And then another story in Matthew 13. It says that in his hometown of Nazareth, where a prophet is not without honor, or is without honor, that he did not do miracles there because of their lack of faith. Also in Matthew, it states that he denounced towns where he did most of his miracles, and he did it because they did not repent. In Mark, he writes how the disciples had been trying unsuccessfully to work a miracle in this epileptic boy. And when Jesus gets to them, and they say, please help, we're not able to perform a miracle. Jesus says to them, "You unbelieving generation, how shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." Or even with Peter, one of his BFFs, who vociferously confessed belief and willingness to even sacrifice his own life. Jesus knew Peter's penchant for doubt. Even near the end of their lifetime, or their life together in person, Jesus knew that Peter would deny him 3 times. That doesn't seem like a successful spiritual teacher to me, even though he was clearly omniscient. Then Jesus is on the cross, and what are some of his last words? "Father, forgive them, for they do not know or cannot understand or can't comprehend what they are doing." Might Jesus have recognized in this statement that he hadn't caused a spiritual revolution for everyone? That he hadn't eradicated spiritual ignorance and grown faith? I'm wondering. And was this worry of not being effectual enough the weight of the world, in part at least, that he carried to Gethsemane and the cross? And then, after his death and resurrection, Mark tells the story of how Jesus, even then, came to his disciples. It says, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. It was more than just women who had seen him, too. Well, clearly, in spite of constantly encountering fear and doubts among humans throughout his ministry and seemingly not being effectual, Jesus continued to heal, to teach, and to love. I mean, think about it. Only a couple of Pharisees appear to have sought him out. Most stayed on their ego trip. Many, including his very own closest followers, did not understand his mission. They didn't understand what love is. How did Jesus keep on? How did Jesus make sense of this? Did Jesus understand that he was being purposeful, productive, and enough? Okay, then there's a second story that I want to share with you. For some reason, it just inspires me and seems connected. I hope it seems connected for you as well. If not, just enjoy or learn from it. The second story is that of the life of Franz Jägerstätter. He's the protagonist in a movie that's titled A Hidden Life. For me, this is a very powerful, inspiring movie that tells a true story. Franz Jägerstätter lived in the gorgeous northern part of Austria near Salzburg. He was an avid reader and an independent thinker. Though rebellious as a youth, he underwent a spiritual awakening after marrying his wife, Franziska, in 1936. Together, they farmed their land and raised 4 daughters. He was a devout Catholic. In 1940, he was drafted into Nazi military service. After weeks of basic training, he was exempted from military duty due to being indispensable on his farm. But then he was drafted again in February 1943. But this time, Jägerstätter said he was prepared to serve as a paramedic, but refused to use a gun due to his religious convictions. Thus, he was imprisoned. The Nazi guards and officers tried to dissuade him with words and then with torture when their logic didn't work. Indeed, even the Catholic priests and a bishop tried to dissuade him. When he was brought to the Reich military court in Berlin in July 1943, the tribunal records show how he defended himself. And I'm quoting from these tribunal records. Only in the past year had he become convinced that as a devout Catholic, he was unable to engage in active military service. It was impossible for him to be a Catholic and at the same time a National Socialist. When he complied with the earlier conscription order, he did so because at that time he considered it a sin not to obey state orders. Now, however, God had given him the thought that it was not a sin to refuse armed service. There were matters in which one was obliged to obey God more than man. The commandment, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," forbade him to engage in armed service, though he was prepared to serve as a paramedic. End quote. Only a month after this tribunal, because of his conscientious objection and refusal to swear an oath to Hitler, Jägerstätter was guillotined. For decades following the war, Jagersdottir's active resistance was largely forgotten, even in his own village. About 60 years later, his story was discovered by a scholar who wrote it up. Perhaps because it wanted to rectify the past, the Catholic Church beatified Jagersdottir in 2007, and then this movie was released in 2019. What intrigues me is not only the courage of Jagersdottir, but the thinking behind it, the thinking that caused the courage. Jagersdottir had immense pressure from his community. The local church officials, even a bishop, and military tribunals. Their small village community scorned him for being a traitor, and they isolated his dear wife. And she had to run their farm all by herself and raise 4 daughters alongside that without him there. The clergy tried to convince him that it'd be for a greater good and that God would forgive him if they were indeed in the wrong. Likewise, various military officers reminded him of how difficult he was making it on his family, never mind that he was undermining the safety of the empire. At least as depicted in the movie, one high-ranking officer tried to calmly change his thinking by telling him that if he was to go to the guillotine, his life would actually be for naught. There'd be no purpose in his death. No one would notice. He invoked the human need for purpose and argued, in effect, that to do the will of the empire would make Jager's life productive enough. So as I think about the stories of Jesus, the story of Jagersdottir, how do I put this together to try to make sense for me as I worry and live with this tension about not being purposeful or productive, at least not enough? Why do these stories of Jesus and Jagersdottir appeal to me as I think about whether my life is purposeful and productive enough? What do these stories teach? What do I take from them to guide me as I think about my purpose and productivity in life? Some thoughts are inspired by the Romans 12 passage that was read earlier. Remember, in this passage it says, "Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought." It's reminding me, we are not God. Instead, we are called to remember who and whose we are, rather than what we do. Jesus knew his Father, and I take it that Hans Jagersdottir seemed to have known that as well. I was listening to a podcast recently where they interviewed a theologian author by the name of Kat Armas. And she tells the story of how she's often impatient with her 4-year-old daughter. And she'll say, "Sweetie, hurry up and put your shoes on." And her daughter will reply, "But Mommy, I'm not a fast person. I'm a slow person." Kat Armas not only takes this as a prompt to slow down and not be beholden to time and productivity, but to relish people, persons, being a person. What matters is not what we do, but who we are. We're human beings, not human doings, right? Well, the wisdom of this 4-year-old also teaches us to remember to live aligned with who we are. We each have a unique purpose, different talents or gifts, as Romans 12 was saying. There's no need, therefore, to compare or compete with others, unless comparing ourselves with someone else does inspire us and help us to be more fully who God designed us to be. I think of a quote from Frederick Buechner, which is in this book we're reading in Sabbath School this right now by Parker Palmer. And the quote goes that vocation is the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. The place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need is our calling, our purpose. Sometimes meeting the world's needs are unheralded. They are hidden, which could raise the question of purpose and productivity. I mean, I think about those who pick up our garbage or clean our sewage or pick our garlic, or, well, that's really purposeful if you ask me, or catalog an article. These are hidden types of work, and yet so needed. At the end of this movie, A Hidden Life, there's this epigraph. It's a quote from a novel by George Eliot. And it goes like this: "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." When I think about purpose and productivity, I remember a time in my life when I had a little insight about this. It was when Lyndon and I were trying to make the decision about whether to live in New Zealand or back here in LA. We were there in New Zealand for a year. I was taking it as a sabbatical and using a lot of that time to pray and discern, well, where I was supposed to live and what I was supposed to do, what was the purpose of my life. And when I was there in New Zealand, I had a spiritual director named Anne who was incredibly helpful to me during this period. And she suggested that when I went for my walks, where I did a lot of my praying, she said, your answer could potentially come in the form of something that something in nature tells you. And it was as though she was planting a seed. I still distinctly remember her saying, "Who knows, maybe God will speak to you through a little tiny flower." So I was out walking, and I came across this gorgeous, long hedge of hydrangeas. In New Zealand, there's a lot of moisture, a lot of rain, so hydrangeas do really well. They just look gorgeous. And I saw this hedge, and it had like little baby hydrangeas, it had adolescent hydrangeas, it had mature adult hydrangeas, and it had even old hydrangeas. And Anne had also said to me, something that will be helpful to you as you think about this process, discerning what your purpose is and place. She said, you might just think ahead to the end of your life and think, imagine yourself perhaps even in a skilled nursing facility in a wheelchair. What would be the purpose of your life then? So I had that also in my mind. And as I was looking at this beautiful hedge, for me, it evoked something. I knew there was some answer in it for me. And I was attracted to these old hydrangeas. They were antiqued. It was like someone had gone and spray painted them with some gold paint. They were just beautiful. And actually, to tell you the truth, I still have a picture of it, and it's like a screensaver for me to just remind me that even the old hydrangea, even the hydrangea that may not seem so purposeful, is still beautiful in God's sight, as this was in my sight. And so for me, that's another piece that helps me to make sense of the question, am I purposeful? Am I productive enough? One last angle as I think about this problem of mine. And it comes to me from a little song that I learned when my kids were young, and I now sing it to Colby. If I was braver than I am, I would sing it for you, but I'm not. So I'm just going to speak it to you. Here's how the song goes. The birdies in the treetops sing their song. The angels chant their chorus all day long. The flowers in the garden blend their hue. So why shouldn't you praise him too? Jesus reminded us to consider how the birds of the air are fed and how the flowers of the field grow without even laboring. That is how pagans who run after food and clothes, and those of faith who know, Jesus is saying in that passage in the Beatitudes that it is pagans who run after food and clothes, and those of faith who know that the Father will fulfill their needs. It isn't just being God's beloved creations and returning the joy of that in praise. That is our soul's purpose and productivity. So to recap what I see as lessons in these stories, it's not about me and how much I do. Rather, it's about being who God made me to be, living the unique gifts God has given me. I am not someone else. I am not God. Instead, as Romans 12 was saying, I am a member of one body with distinct gifts that are graced to me. If my gift is to live a seemingly hidden life or a very public one, God be praised. If my gift is to encourage a small circle of people and not to become a leader or a financier, then I can encourage my small circle and not envy or pine that I'm not doing something else or something more. I am to live out the gifts graced to me, appreciating that God will do good work in me and praising God for that. What matters is who I am and whose I am.